This is the first Energy Glen barn. Just a year ago it looked like this. It was scheduled to be demolished and was saved by the Southside Historical Village. I am a volunteer of the village and I filmed the barn being disassembled, restored, and reassembled. Join me as I show you how we saved the barn. The Southside Historical Village was established in 1995 and is located at the Hookstown Fairgrounds in Hookstown, Pennsylvania. Their mission is to collect, preserve, and interpret early American life. The association displays artifacts, presents tours, festivals, and educational programs. The village began with a donation of the Mercer one-room schoolhouse. Volunteers relocated and restored the schoolhouse, and now it is used for presentations and tours. Docents explain the history of the schoolhouse, the village, and the local community, which includes the Indian story. This building was relocated to the village and restored as an 1880s blacksmith shop. Demonstrations are conducted explaining the importance of a blacksmith in early years and the items he would make. Instructors also explain the use of tools and basic blacksmith techniques. Once a corn crib, this now walk-through covered bridge holds a cache of surprises. The Chapman oil derrick has been erected, and one of the newest projects is the Nelson's doctor's office. It was recently relocated to the village, and volunteers are presently restoring the office. It was used for practice locally during the early 1900s until the 1950s and will display medical artifacts. After a lot of hard work relocating and restoring the Johnson log cabin, it was dedicated during the Hookstown Fair. Volunteers dress in period time clothing and demonstrate making textiles and show how they were used. During monthly open house events, they also cook using open hearth techniques. The newest and biggest building at the village is the First Energy Glen barn. It is a bank barn dated 1858 and was located only a few miles from the village. The Southside Historical Village hired Amish contractors to disassemble, relocate, restore, and reassemble the barn onto a new foundation. This type of barn, which has a timber frame with hewn logs and joined with wooden pegs, is disappearing from the American landscape at an alarming rate. Some organizations have referred to the loss of these barns as a crisis in America. The Historical Village wants to preserve an American icon and use it to showcase historical and agricultural-related artifacts. The Historical Village learned that a bank barn built in 1858 was to be demolished. The barn had hewn logs and peg joints and looked in good condition. The hewn logs and peg joints are an indication the barn may be over 100 years old. The idea was discussed about relocating the barn to the village. First Energy, a regional energy provider, owned the barn. The Historical Village approached First Energy, asking them to donate the barn, and would they be a major financial contributor. First Energy realized the significance of the barn to the village and community and agreed. The announcement was made at the 2010 Evening of Music. The event is the major fundraiser for the Historical Village. The announcement was only the beginning. The village would need more financial backing and would need to ask local businesses and volunteers to donate equipment, material, money, and time. The historical village didn't waste any time getting the project underway. First, a video showing the size and condition of the barn was sent to contractors for bids. The Southside Historical Village had to be practical about the project. Ideally, they would have liked to relocate and restore the barn and foundation, but that would have been too costly. So it was decided to have a new foundation built, the barn disassembled, and then reassembled on the new foundation located in the village at the fairgrounds. Once a contractor was secured, the arduous task of arranging for all the materials, equipment, and volunteers that would be needed for the project began. On September 3, 2011, less than a year from the announcement of the barn project, the groundbreaking ceremony was held. The new site for the barn was excavated, the foundation poured, and the block walls began to take shape. After the blocks were laid, the walls were poured with a concrete mix, and a different contractor was at the barn site starting to disassemble the barn. From this point on, the project was called the First Energy Glen Barn. The first step to disassemble the barn was to remove the siding and all the nails from the floorboards. This was previously completed by volunteers. Before any of the timber frame was removed, pictures were taken of all sections of the barn. Copies were made of the pictures, and every piece of the timber frame was given a number. An aluminum tab was screwed into each piece of the timber frame with the corresponding number. When reassembling the barn, the crew would know where each piece goes. The crew began removing the corrugated metal roofing. This was a very laborious task. The nail heads were pulling off, leaving the shank of the nails sticking up through the roofing material. They would need to hammer the nails through the corrugated metal to get the roofing material off. Fortunately, on the back side, the metal roofing could be rolled off, with the nails coming up with the roofing material. Once all the corrugated roofing was removed, the roof sheeting was exposed. Removing the sheeting was also a time-consuming process. Once the sheeting was removed, it was stacked on piles for loading onto the trailer. The rafters needed to be removed next. Rafters are actually built on top of a building one at a time and secured into place to form the roof. The rafters in this barn were hewn trees. They were secured to the beams with nails. The nails were sawed off because the crew didn't want to damage the hewn rafters. The rafters were removed one at a time. Later, they would be loaded onto a trailer and moved to the new site. The timber frame now needed to be removed. The crew needed a crane for this part of the project. They only had the use of the crane for one day and needed to remove the entire frame of the barn. The top two beam sections were removed first. To do this, the wooden pegs that connect the beam and the braces to the lower section were removed by drilling the wooden pegs. A steel beam was used to support and evenly distribute the weight when lifting the beams and braces. Once on the ground, the remaining pegs were removed and the beam's post and braces were disassembled. The beam was then loaded onto a waiting trailer, and then the second beam and braces were removed. Again, they removed any pegs that still joined the beam section to the timber frame. They used a steel beam again to support the section being removed. Once the beam section was on the ground, it was also disassembled and loaded onto the trailer. There are 4 beams that support the roof. Each beam is 60 feet in length and is in one piece. This means the beams came from a tree with a trunk of over 60 feet in length. The other 2 beams were removed and loaded onto the waiting trailer. There are 15 different post and brace pegs that needed removed before lifting these 2 beams. This will prove to be one of the more difficult pieces of the frame to reassemble. The remaining barn's timber frame was removed in sections. The first section was an outside wall. Using the steel beam, the entire outside wall section was lifted off and placed on the ground. Later, all the sections would be disassembled. They only had the use of the crane for one day and needed to get the entire barn's frame removed. 2 post and braces were removed and placed onto the ground. The next piece of the timber frame to be removed was an inner wall section. Again, it is lifted with the steel beam and placed on the ground. This process was repeated until the entire barn's frame was removed. Next, the flooring and floor beams were removed. The floor beams were also hewn logs. Quite a few floor beams were damaged due to rotting and were left where the barn once stood. Everything was loaded onto trailers and transported to the new home at the fairgrounds. Once at the fairgrounds, the pieces were unloaded and sorted. The crew also checked for damaged beams and posts. The historical village knew the front floor beams from the barn were rotted and needed to be replaced. Ideally, they would like to have replaced the damaged pieces with period time posts and beams, but again they needed to be practical and keep within their budget. A portable sawmill was used to cut new floor beams to replace the old beams. Also in the new foundation, steel beams were being used to replace the original floor beams that supported the floor lengthwise. The original floor beams would be used as replacement beams throughout the barn. The work of repairing posts and beams began. This entire post was damaged and unusable. However, there was a way to repair it and keep the appearance of the original post. For this restoration, the damaged section was removed, leaving a two-sided veneer. The veneer was about 2 inches thick and had no structural strength. It would act as a cap when secured to a new post. A new post was cut to size, replacing the damaged section, and secured with long screws. The post would look completely original and now would support the load. To repair the damage to this beam required more work. The damaged part was hewn out. 3 2x6s replaced the area that was damaged. Everything was glued and screwed together. The original back sill beam was rotted and needed to be replaced. one of the original floor beams that were replaced by the steel beams was used. Once a notch was laid out, a worker would cut out the notch with a reciprocating saw. Next, the notch was pried out of the beam and then was sized using a flat chisel. With the repairs completed, the walls needed to be rebuilt on the ground. The workers look at the picture of the wall they need to build. They determine what pieces they needed and search for the beams and supports with the corresponding numbers needed for the wall. The wall was laid out on the ground with all the pieces ready to be reassembled. Just because a piece was removed and is being returned to its original place doesn't mean the joints all assemble easily. After some hard work, they joined the pieces and secured the joints using new wooden pegs. The reassembly of the First Energy Glen barn now began. They started at the back of the barn. The two back corner beams were guided into place. Then the third beam, the middle of the back sill beam, was lowered into place. This piece is not the original sill beam. The original was too damaged and was replaced by using another beam of the barn. You can see the new notches that were cut into the beam. The replacement beam and original beam's ends must marry perfectly. This creates a scab joint. It's a tight fit, but after moving one sill beam about half an inch, the fit is perfect. The next sill beam to be lifted into place was the right wall sill beam. The right wall actually had two sill beams. This end of the beam has a tenon. First, the tenon was slid into the mortise of the back wall sill. Then the beam was guided into position. The second part of the sill beam was secured into place, and then the left side sill beam was lifted. Like the other side sill beam, it too must have the tenon slid into the back sill beam. Then it was lowered into place. The rear floor beams were now lifted into place. The end of the floor beams were shaped like a tenon. They were placed back into their original notch in the sill beam. The middle sill beam is the replacement beam with the new notches. Now the workers will see if the original floor beams will fit into the replacement beam correctly. They fit perfectly. The original floor beams needed trimmed to make room for the front floor beams. Now the front floor beams were lowered into place. All of the front beams are the replacement beams. They were longer than needed and were cut to length. A 2x6 fascia board was nailed to the end of the front floor beams. Later, the siding will extend past the front floor beams and the barn will look original. The floorboards were lifted onto the floor beams. Some of the floorboards were laid down as temporary floor so the workers could stand safely when guiding the wall sections into place. The first section of the timber frame to be lifted was an inner wall. Like before, the section was connected to a steel beam to spread the load and lift the timber frame section evenly. The section needed to be returned to its original place. Workers guided the section and temporarily secured it using screws and 2x4 braces. Next, a support post with braces and rails was lifted into place. All of the mortise and tenon joints needed to be joined as the post was put into place. A rail is secured with a wooden peg and more temporary braces are used. The opposite post with supports and rail were guided into place. Again, the mortise and tenon joints needed to be joined as the post was put into place. Now the outer wall section was lifted. The crew must be careful. The lifted wall section can swing into the temporary supported inner wall section and knock it down. Carefully, the outer section was guided into its original place. Rails were secured with wooden pegs, screws, and 2x4s. The center post and rails where the barn doors are located were lifted into place. You can see this section needed a lot of 2x4 supports when lifted. The back post and rail supports were guided into place also. Next was the other inner wall. Just like the opposite inner wall, all of the supports and rail joints need to line up as the wall was guided into place. The last two support posts with braces and rails were guided into position. Once secured, the last outer wall was lifted. Again, they needed to be very careful. This section could swing out of control and hit the erected frame, causing the entire timber frame to collapse. The crew needed to start tying the frame together. One of the long 60-foot roof beams and supports was lifted into place. As the workers guided the section into place, one at a time they fit the joints together and used a wooden peg to secure each joint. The second 60-foot roof beam is lifted to the workers. Darkness was falling, and they wanted to get the other two 60-foot roof beams in place. They didn't know when the crane operator would be able to return. As the sun was setting, they began the lift of the third roof beam. This was just the beam, but there were 15 mortise and tenon joints that all had to be joined at the same time. This would prove to be one of the more difficult beams to reassemble. To see in the dark, they used two vehicles' headlights shining on the barn. They eased the beam down on the frame, but they couldn't get everything lined up. Over an hour later, the crew finally got the beam secured. The next day, the roof beam needed to be put into place. Hopefully, this beam would be easier than the one the night before. Over an hour passed, and this beam was more difficult than the other. Finally, all the joints lined up and could be secured with new pegs. The next step was to reassemble the rafters. The hewn trees that were used for the rafters showed no sign of rot or damage, so they didn't need any repairs. They placed the rafters onto the notches where they were originally. While the barn's entire timber frame was erected, the building was not square. The crew took measurements to determine where the building's frame needed straightened. They removed temporary bracing in some locations. In other locations, the posts needed to be pulled into position. Once the frame was squared, it was time to nail the roof sheeting onto the rafters. The roof sheeting wasn't numbered before removing. They take measurements and a line was struck on the rafters, so when the roof sheeting was nailed in place, everything was in a straight line. The boards were then nailed to the rafters. This gives strength to the roof and was what the metal roofing was secured to. While the sheeting boards were being nailed into place, many deliveries of donated fill material were delivered. A volunteer used his machine to level the foundation floor. Now that the roof sheeting was completed, the crew begins to frame a dormer. Although the dormer is not historically accurate, it was added to increase interior light. Also, a number of additional windows and louvers would be added. Work continued on the dormer, and fascia boards on the roof were added. Once that was completed, it was time for the aluminum roof. Originally, it was thought the barn had a slate roof. Later, the slate was replaced with corrugated metal sheets. This was another decision the historical village needed to be practical about. They wanted a roof that was economical, but also low maintenance. They chose the aluminum roof for its durability and affordability. Also, with all the traffic passing by, and thousands of people attending the fair each year, it is hoped the barn will attract more attention and interest for the historical village. At the time the roof was being installed, work continued on the floorboards. When the barn was disassembled, it had 3 different floorboard thicknesses. All of the flooring needed to be the same thickness. It was decided 2 inches would be the thickness of the floor. Red oak logs were donated to the village. Using the portable sawmill and volunteers, the oak logs were sawed into new floorboards. The workers used the original floorboards they had and finished the floor with the new boards. The historical village had ordered new siding for the barn. They decided to use hemlock. The problem was there were only a few suppliers and the siding might not arrive before winter. Finally, the siding arrived just in time. The crew went right to work. First, the siding boards were nailed vertically. Then a thinner strip called the batten was nailed over the siding joints. The Green Initiative for Lighting and Ventilation called for the addition of louvers and windows to the barn. Once the siding was installed, the workers traced out the area for the louvers. Using the tracing, the rough opening for the louvers was cut out. The windows were installed the same way. New barn doors were made on site for both the front and back openings. The addition of the lightning rods, gutters, and downspouts completed the contractor's work. Volunteers helped with sealing the wood siding and landscaping. The First Energy Glen barn was dedicated during the 2012 Hookstown Fair and was a huge attraction for the historical village. The Southside Historical Village Association is thankful for the volunteers and members for saving the barn.